Welcome back to Mr. Blackwood, a place where you can experience tension and terror as your bedtime introduction. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and like this video to get more scary stories every night. Now, take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's begin tonight's scary story. Dylan Hartley hadn't been prepared for the silence. After years of relentless noise, the sounds of gunfire, helicopter blades slicing the air, explosions shaking the ground, and the frantic calls of his fellow soldiers, coming back to San Diego felt like an eerie emptiness. The wide streets, palm trees swaying in the wind, the sound of ocean waves crashing against the shore, and the casual hum of city life. It all seemed so distant. Nothing could prepare him for the haunting contrast. His feet hit the ground, and it wasn't the bustling city life that welcomed him, but an oppressive weight, a ghost that followed him from the battlefields of war. As the cab rolled into his neighborhood, Dylan could see the familiar sights. His modest home with its white picket fence, the bright yellow door his mother had always wanted. He had seen it in photos, heard his parents talk about how different it looked now with the new coat of paint. Yet even before the cab came to a complete stop, he knew he was no longer the person who left this place. As he sat down with his parents, a quiet comfort filled the room. The past hadn't gone away, it never would, but Dylan was ready to face it, ready to rebuild piece by piece. The healing process was just beginning, and though it wasn't easy, he knew that taking the first step was the hardest part. And maybe that was all he could do for now. Face the past, accept the pain, and start again, one step at a time. The journey toward healing wasn't linear, and there would still be hard days ahead. But Dylan knew now that he wasn't defined by his past. He was defined by the courage it took to face it, and the willingness to try again. Dylan opened the door. His mother was sitting in the living room, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and worry. His father stood by the window, looking out at the street. When they saw him, they didn't say anything at first. There was no need for words. His return was enough. His mother got up and walked toward him, her arms open. Dylan stepped into her embrace, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to be held. He didn't need to explain everything in that moment. He didn't have the words for it. But his mother's warmth, the steady presence of his father, the simple act of being home, it was enough. It was a small step, but it was the first real step in his healing. "You don't have to do this alone, Dylan," his father said quietly, his voice full of understanding and unspoken support. "We're here for you whenever you're ready." Dylan nodded, his throat tight. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. He didn't have to face it alone anymore. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time, he felt like he had the strength to walk it. Dylan started walking home, each step a reminder of how far he had come, even if it was only a small distance. The shadows that had once seemed all-encompassing now felt less threatening. He had finally come to terms with the fact that he couldn't outrun the past, but he could find a way to move forward with it. The ghosts would always be there in some form, but they didn't have to define him. He could learn to live with them, even if it meant facing them every day. As Dylan walked into the quiet of his neighborhood, the familiar sights of home seemed different, less alien. The house where he had grown up no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a place where he could start to rebuild, not just physically, but emotionally. The weight of the past had not been completely lifted, but it was no longer a burden that defined him. When he reached the front door, he paused, his hand on the doorknob. For a long time, he had been afraid of what would happen if he came home, afraid of facing the people he loved, afraid of confronting his own reflection. But now, as he stood there, he knew it was time. Time to face the people who had always loved him, to allow himself the chance to heal. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He hesitated before pulling it out, not sure what to expect. It was a message from his mother. "Dylan, we've been worried about you. Are you okay? Please come home. We love you." He stared at the screen for a long moment, the words sinking into him like a balm. His parents had tried so hard to reach him, but Dylan had been too lost in his own mind to see it. Now, in the stillness of the night, with the weight of his own grief a little less unbearable, he felt ready to take that step back, to face them, to be with them again. not as the broken version of himself, but as someone who was slowly, cautiously, learning how to rebuild. He didn't know how to respond to them just yet. He didn't have all the answers. He still had a long road ahead of him, but he knew he wasn't alone anymore. He had faced his demons in that park, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was fighting them alone. Dylan didn't look back as he left the park, the distant streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. The cool night air washed over him, and though his body was still heavy with the weight of his past, there was a faint sense of relief, as if a small part of him had finally let go. The ghosts that had been following him, those fragmented memories that had clung to him like chains, seemed quieter now, as if they were retreating for the moment. The weight of the burden wasn't completely gone, but he could breathe a little easier. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, or whether he would be able to move past the deep scars of war. The pain of loss, the guilt of survival, still gnawed at him like a silent shadow, but something in him had shifted. It wasn't a miracle, it wasn't a magical fix. But in that moment, Dylan realized that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it, learning to face it without running from it. As he walked through the empty streets, the silence wasn't deafening anymore. He could hear his footsteps, sure, but the world around him felt less oppressive, as if the weight of his past had loosened its grip, even if just a little. He had taken the first step toward healing, and that was enough for now. He took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a glimmer of clarity. He didn't know what came next, but he knew he couldn't keep carrying the weight of his regrets alone. He had to start somewhere, and maybe, just maybe, facing the truth was the first step toward healing. Dylan walked away from the swings, his steps slow but purposeful. The park was still, as quiet as it had been when he arrived. The darkness didn't feel as suffocating now. It was as if the night had opened up to him, offering a path forward. He didn't know where it would lead, or what would happen next, but he wasn't running anymore. The road ahead was uncertain, and Dylan still didn't know if he was ready to face all that he had done, or all that had happened to him. But he knew he couldn't keep avoiding it. He couldn't keep letting the past control him. It was time to take the first step, however small, into a future where he could begin to heal. As Dylan made his way back into the night, he didn't feel free. He wasn't ready to call it freedom. But for the first time in a long while, he felt something that he hadn't felt in years. Hope. "Jake, I'm sorry," Dylan whispered, his voice barely audible. The words felt like a release, like a weight was being lifted from his chest with each syllable. The guilt, the shame, the anger, everything he had held onto for so long began to crack, splintering under the weight of his grief. He stayed there for a long time, the minutes stretching into what felt like an eternity. The world seemed to hold him in that space, suspended between the past and the present, between who he had been and who he was now. The shadows, the guilt, the ghosts, they no longer felt like something to fight against. They were part of him, and maybe it was time to accept that. The night air grew still, and Dylan finally stood up. He felt unsteady, but not in the same way he had felt before. His legs were shaking, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from the release, from the acknowledgement of the pain he had buried for so long. He was still broken, still haunted, but something had shifted inside him. The heavy burden of running from the past had finally lifted, at least for now. As the voices from the past faded, a sudden silence filled the park. The air felt thick, but it wasn't suffocating anymore. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for him to take the next step. Dylan's hand, still pressed against his face, trembled. He had always been terrified of confronting what he had lost, terrified of acknowledging the grief that had built up over the years. But now, in this moment, he knew that there was no other choice. "Why didn't I save you?" Dylan whispered to the empty space, his voice cracking. He wasn't sure who he was talking to, Jake, the other soldiers, or even to himself. But the question had been gnawing at him for as long as he could remember. The guilt of not being able to protect the people who had trusted him, who had fought beside him, ate away at his soul. The silence around him felt less oppressive now, as if the park, too, was waiting for him to let go. The voices, the shadows, the unspoken accusations, they had been part of his burden. part of the chains that had kept him from moving forward. And now, with every tear that fell, with every shaky breath he took, he could feel the weight of those chains loosening, if only just a little. The weight of Dylan's realizations hung heavily in the air as he knelt in the abandoned park, the world around him dissolving into a blur of memories and emotions. The sound of the swing creaking, the faint voices whispering his name. It all felt like the ghosts of his past were gathering, each of them demanding a reckoning. Dylan sat there for what seemed like hours, but in reality, only a few minutes had passed. His body felt cold despite the warmth of the night, and his mind was clouded with a mixture of guilt and sorrow. The tears that had welled up in his eyes now seemed to carry the weight of everything he had buried. The faces of the soldiers he had lost, the choices he had made, the blood on his hands, everything that had haunted him for so long seemed to materialize in this single moment. For the first time since his return from the war, Dylan allowed himself to truly feel. The emotions that had been buried under layers of denial and distraction came rushing to the surface. There was no escaping them now. He could no longer keep running, no longer pretend that the past hadn't shaped him, that the darkness he had been carrying inside wasn't a part of who he had become. The figures from the past began to emerge in his mind's eye, his fallen comrades, those he couldn't save, those who had paid the price for his survival. He saw their faces, their bloodied bodies, their eyes filled with fear and confusion. They were all here now, in the park with him, haunting him with the things he had seen, the things he had done. The swing kept moving, its creak a constant reminder of his failure, of the lives lost, of the promises he couldn't keep. The memory of Jake, the one who had died in that ambush, was too much to bear. Suddenly, Dylan dropped to his knees, his hands pressed against his face as the overwhelming emotion surged through him like a tidal wave. His chest heaved, and tears welled in his eyes, though he didn't know when they had started to fall. He had been so focused on surviving, on escaping the nightmare of war, that he had never allowed himself to mourn, to process, to confront the grief that had lodged itself deep within him. But now it was here. It had caught up with him. He had no choice but to face it. He had no choice but to finally let go. As he sat there, broken and raw, the weight of the past pressing down on him like 1,000 stones, Dylan finally understood. He couldn't outrun it. He couldn't hide anymore. The ghosts of the past would always be with him. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to make peace with them. Dylan's head snapped toward the sound, but there was no one there. Just the empty park, the slowly swaying swing, and the thick, oppressive air. The voice came again, and this time Dylan could feel it deep in his chest. Face it, Dylan, it's time. He could no longer deny it. This wasn't just his imagination. This wasn't just some nightmare. His past, the war, the trauma, the friends he had lost, the things he had done. It had been haunting him since the day he returned, and now it was catching up to him. It was all crashing down on him, forcing him to confront the truth he had been running from. With every step, Dylan could feel the weight of the years he had spent buried beneath the surface, trying to forget. His mind screamed for him to stop, to get away from the park, from the swing, from the shadow that seemed to linger behind him. But he couldn't move, he couldn't run. The past had him trapped, cornered. The pain in his chest intensified, and suddenly he was back on the battlefield. The noise, the screams, the explosions, it all came rushing back, overwhelming him in a flood of chaotic memories. His vision warped, and for a moment, he couldn't tell where the park ended and the war began. His body tensed, as if he were once again in the middle of a firefight, under attack from every direction. He walked over to it, his steps hesitant, unsure if he was walking towards something he shouldn't see. His heart raced as the swings continued their slow back-and-forth motion, a rhythmic squeaking that seemed to pierce the quiet. There was something unsettling about the swing's movement. It wasn't natural. It wasn't just the wind. It was as if something or someone was still there, waiting, watching. The faintest flicker of a shadow appeared behind him, but when he spun around, no one was there. His breath quickened, and the adrenaline surged through his veins, setting his senses alight with fear. But that wasn't the worst part. As he reached out toward the swing, A sudden, sharp pain shot through his chest. It wasn't physical. It was as if something had just punctured his very soul. The sheer weight of regret and guilt pressing in on him. His body went rigid. His breath became shallow, and his vision blurred. And then he heard it. The voice again. Clear, distinct. Not in his head this time, but from somewhere behind him. Dylan. It wasn't Jake this time. It was someone else. Someone familiar but distant. His mother. His father. Both of them had spoken his name in that same way, full of pain and concern. The voice cracked like they were pleading with him to stop, to face what he had been running from. He didn't even remember walking there, but the overwhelming sense of dread that filled him told him he had arrived at the right place, though it felt wrong, like it was meant to be some kind of reckoning. It wasn't just the park, it was his mind, racing, overwhelming him. In the distance, the faint hum of a car engine broke the silence. It was the only sound that seemed to exist now. But even that sound seemed distant and muffled, like the world had become a vacuum and Dylan was floating aimlessly in it, unable to connect with anything, anyone. Without thinking, he started walking toward the playground. The feeling of being watched crept up his spine, like eyes were on him, even though he couldn't see anyone around. He shook his head, trying to clear the mental fog, but it only seemed to grow denser with each passing moment. As Dylan approached the swings, he noticed something strange. One of the swings was moving, slowly, as if someone had just gotten off of it, leaving the chain still swaying back and forth. His chest tightened, and he could feel the sweat beading on his skin, despite the cool night air. The swing creaked with each movement, its eerie sound amplified in the stillness of the park. Dylan had no idea how long he sat in that alley. The world around him felt like it had gone silent, like all sound had been swallowed by the darkness. When he finally managed to stand up, his legs were unsteady, as if they had forgotten how to support him. He didn't know what had just happened, whether it was a hallucination, a dream, or something else entirely. All he knew was that he couldn't escape it. He stumbled through the alleyway, his mind reeling from the encounter, from the figure of Jake, from the overwhelming feeling of guilt that pressed against him like a physical weight. It felt as though the air had grown thicker, suffocating him with each breath. He needed to get away. He needed to be anywhere but here. His mind was a storm, crashing waves of confusion and terror, and no matter how fast he walked, he couldn't outrun it. Dylan didn't know how much time had passed when he found himself standing outside a small, abandoned park. He had wandered aimlessly, driven by the overwhelming need to escape from the scene, from the ghost that had appeared in front of him, and from the memories that had resurfaced. The park looked almost as desolate as he felt, its swing swaying slowly in the wind, the rusted, weathered equipment standing still, as if it too was waiting for something to happen. Jake's figure knelt beside him, the coldness of the alley seeping into his bones. The apparition reached out a hand, but Dylan couldn't bring himself to look up, to face the person he had lost, the friend he had failed. "You're not alone," the figure said softly, his voice distant, yet comforting. "But you have to stop running from this. You have to face it, before it destroys you." The world around him seemed to collapse inward, spinning faster and faster until the ground beneath him tilted. The pain, the guilt, the suffocating weight of everything he had tried to bury, everything he had tried to outrun, came crashing down on him all at once. And just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure of Jake began to fade. His form dissolved into the shadows, his voice lingering in the cold, empty alley. Dylan was left alone, trembling on the ground, unable to speak, unable to move. His mind reeled, spinning in a haze of grief and guilt that refused to let him go. The alley was silent again, except for the sound of his uneven breathing. Dylan didn't know how long he sat there, his body shaking, his mind shattered. But he knew one thing for certain. This was no dream. This was no hallucination. It was a reckoning. He had been running for too long, and now the past had caught up with him. Dylan had to face it, whether he was ready or not. "Jake, no, this isn't real," Dylan muttered, stepping back, his hands trembling. His chest tightened, and he could feel his heart racing out of control. He was dreaming, or hallucinating, or losing his grip on reality. There was no way that Jake, his friend, the one who had died in the ambush, could be standing right in front of him. The figure stepped forward, and Dylan's body went rigid. He could feel the air grow colder with each step the figure took toward him. It was as if the very space around them had grown darker, heavier. "I'm sorry," the figure whispered, his voice fading in and out. "But you have to face it, Dylan. You have to face what you did. You can't escape." Dylan couldn't move. His mind was swimming in confusion. He wanted to run, to get away from this nightmare. He wanted to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His chest tightened as he felt his legs give way beneath him, his knees buckling under the weight of everything that had come crashing down upon him. The guilt, the trauma, the things he had witnessed, the things he had done, the things he had failed to do. "Please, no," Dylan choked out, his voice barely audible. His entire body shook as he collapsed to the ground, the cold pavement pressing against his palms. Then, as he stepped into the alley, something changed. The air grew colder. A chill ran through him, and his breath came out in visible puffs. His vision blurred for a moment, the edges of the alley seeming to distort, bending and warping like the reality itself was shifting. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog from his mind, but it only grew worse. And then, standing in front of him, materialized a figure. Dylan stopped dead in his tracks. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the figure in the dim light. The figure was tall, clothed in military gear that looked too familiar. His heart pounded as he recognized the face. It was his friend, the one who had died in battle. His friend Jake stood there, his face unscarred but somehow different. Hollow eyes, a faraway expression, like he wasn't fully there, like a ghost. But the likeness was unmistakable. "Jake?" Dylan whispered, his voice shaking. The figure didn't respond, but Dylan could see his mouth move, forming words. "Dylan, you can't keep running," the figure said, his voice echoing in the alley. It wasn't quite Jake's voice, but it was close enough that Dylan could barely breathe, his body frozen in disbelief. It was more than a whisper now. It was clear, sharp, and unmistakable. The voice echoed in his head, and for the first time, it felt like it wasn't just a memory anymore. It was real. It was as if someone was standing right behind him. Dylan spun around, his breath catching in his throat, his heart hammered in his chest. The street was empty, but the air felt thick, as if it was holding its breath. His body stiffened, every muscle tensed, ready to flee. He didn't know why, but he took a step forward, toward the sound of the voice, toward the direction that felt wrong. His feet moved without his consent, almost like they were being pulled by some invisible force. The voice was calling to him, dragging him deeper into the darkness. He followed it, down the street, past the old shops with boarded-up windows, and the half-abandoned buildings that loomed like silent witnesses to his growing unease. There was no one around, just the quiet hum of distant cars and the occasional barking dog. But Dylan couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, something in the shadows. He reached a narrow alleyway, tucked between two crumbling buildings. It looked deserted, dark, and foreboding. His legs felt heavy, his chest tight, but he walked forward, compelled by the voice, the call that wouldn't stop. Dylan wasn't sure how long he had been walking. His mind was foggy, and his body felt like it wasn't entirely his own anymore. He kept hearing that voice, the whisper of his fallen comrade, haunting and relentless, pulling him back toward something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The walk seemed endless, and the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street. Dylan hadn't realized how far he had gone until he found himself in a part of town that was unfamiliar, a neighborhood he hadn't set foot in since his childhood. The streets here were older, quieter. The homes were smaller, some looking a little worn down, as if the years had left their marks. The streetlights flickered as they came to life, casting a sickly yellow glow on the pavement. He felt out of place. Something about the area made him uneasy. He hadn't meant to walk this far. It wasn't like he was trying to find his way back home. It was just the road beneath his feet guiding him. But as he stood on the corner, staring at the intersection, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him. Then it happened again. The voice. Dylan. But the voice lingered. It echoed in his mind. Dylan. The same voice that had haunted him throughout the war. The same voice of his fallen comrade. He could hear the desperation in it, the pain, the call for help that would never come. He didn't know what to do. His legs shook, his mind spinning, and he stumbled to the ground. He felt like he was losing his grip on reality, like the world was slipping away from him, and there was no way to get it back. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Dylan, you can't run from this. You can't run from me." Dylan's breath caught in his throat as he looked around, but there was no one there. No one but the memories, the ghosts of his past that had come to claim him. And in that moment, he realized something he hadn't wanted to accept before. He couldn't outrun the past. It was always with him, waiting, following him, no matter how far he ran. The crash had been a wake-up call, a reminder that no matter how far he tried to distance himself, the trauma would always follow. He could not escape from himself. He had to face what he had done, the people he had lost, the things he had seen, and maybe, just maybe, that was the only way to find peace. But Dylan wasn't sure he was ready to face that yet. The question remained, how could he? He had to get away from here. He had to keep moving, to outrun whatever it was that was chasing him. His past, his demons, his mind. He turned away from the wreck, his body stiff as he stumbled down the road, hoping to escape the overwhelming weight of the reality he couldn't face. He walked aimlessly, not sure where he was headed or what he was even doing anymore. He was running from the past, running from the darkness that had followed him home, from the shadow of his own mind that never seemed to let him rest. The further he walked, the less it felt like he was in control. His mind raced with flashes of his past, of the things he had seen and done, faces, screams, the scent of gunpowder and death. He couldn't stop the memories, couldn't shake the weight of them pressing down on him like a suffocating fog. That's when it happened. The whisper. It came from behind him, faint at first, but unmistakable. His name. The voice was familiar, like a distant memory, but it was distorted, tainted by time, by pain, by death. "Dylan!" He froze, his breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded in his chest. He turned around quickly, but there was nothing there. No one. Only the empty road stretching ahead of him. He stood there for a moment, trying to steady himself, his legs unsteady beneath him. The dizzying feeling in his head mixed with the sense of panic that tightened his chest. His body screamed for air, and for a moment, he thought he was suffocating. He looked back at the wrecked car, its front crumpled and smoking, and he couldn't help but think of the countless wrecks in the war. Each one a scene of carnage, of lives torn apart in an instant. But even more, it reminded him of how fragile he felt, how fragile life could be. Everything about the crash felt like a reflection of his internal chaos. One wrong turn, and everything went spiraling out of control. His thoughts, his emotions, his entire existence, it was all teetering on the edge. Dylan forced himself to take a deep breath, his hands gripping the edge of the car as he tried to steady his legs. He needed to move, to get out of there, to escape. But the world around him felt distorted, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. His mind drifted back to the war. He could almost hear the distant rumble of the helicopters, the shouts of his comrades, the explosions ringing in his ears. The same feeling of being trapped, the same feeling of being stuck in a place he couldn't leave, had crept back into his bones. He turned the corner, eyes darting around for a sign, anything to help him settle his mind. But it wasn't long before he found himself driving through unfamiliar streets, the world around him becoming more of a blur with each passing mile. A sound broke through his thoughts, the harsh screech of tires. He swerved instinctively, his heart leaping into his throat, and suddenly he found himself in a spin. The steering wheel jerked in his hands, and the car veered to the side of the road. Before he knew it, the tires had left the asphalt completely, and the car slammed into a large oak tree, the impact jarring his entire body as the world spun out of control. Dylan's head slammed into the side window, the glass shattering with a deafening crack. The car jolted to a halt, and everything fell eerily silent. For a moment he couldn't breathe. His chest felt tight, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it thundering in his ears. His hands were shaking as he fumbled for the door, pushing it open and stumbling out onto the pavement. He didn't even know where he was anymore. The street was unfamiliar, the trees looming around him in ominous silence. His vision blurred. and he felt dizzy from the crash. But it wasn't the impact that had him shaking. It was the overwhelming sensation that he was once again caught in something far beyond his control. The house, with all its whispering shadows and oppressive silence, had become unbearable. He had to get away, to break free from the memories and the haunting presence that seemed to follow him everywhere. The car, an old dusty sedan his father had used for years, sat in the driveway. Dylan hadn't driven it in a long time, but today, the thought of taking the wheel seemed like the only thing that would help him escape. He started the engine, the sound of the car's sputtering engine, a strange comfort in the eerie quiet of the neighborhood. He threw it in gear and pulled out onto the street, the tires crunching against the gravel beneath him. It was a start, a small step, but a step away from the suffocating grip of the house. For a moment, the road in front of him felt open, endless even, and for a fleeting second, he could pretend that he was just another man on the road, free from the past, from the war, from the ghosts. But the further he drove, the more his thoughts began to spiral. He gripped the steering wheel too tightly, his knuckles white against the leather. His pulse raced, and every passing streetlight seemed to distort into something else, into flashes of explosions, the flashes of fire from the battlefield. He couldn't escape it. The war was everywhere, inside him, outside him. The noise, the chaos, it was all there. It was the kind of day when the sky stretched out, too blue and empty to match the turbulence swirling inside Dylan's mind. The day had started like any other. His father had gone out to run errands, and his mother had spent most of the morning cleaning, a futile attempt to restore order to the house. Dylan had stayed inside, mostly lost in his thoughts, staring at nothing in particular as he tried to block out the constant barrage of memories, of faces, of screams. But the moment something shifted, something in the air, or perhaps in his head, he couldn't be sure. It was as if the ground beneath him had tilted, throwing him off balance, like he was walking on a precipice. The need for escape had become overwhelming. Dylan knew he had to get out. His body had been aching to leave the house for days, but it had been the constant knot in his chest, the anxiety creeping through his veins that held him in place. He hadn't left the house in nearly a week. He wasn't sure if it was his mind or his heart that was keeping him imprisoned. Maybe both. He grabbed his jacket from the hallway, his fingers trembling as he slipped his arms into the sleeves. He didn't think about where he was going. He just needed to leave. Dylan stood up abruptly, his heart racing, his head spinning. He glanced toward the hallway, but the house remained still. The only sound now was his own frantic breathing. Slowly, he made his way toward the door, but as he passed the hallway, he heard a whisper, a voice so faint that it was almost imperceptible. Dylan. His name. It was a whisper. A familiar voice, but distorted, like a memory he couldn't quite place. He stopped in his tracks. His blood ran cold. It was a voice he knew. He had heard it before. The voice of his fallen comrade, the one he couldn't save. He spun around, his eyes searching the darkened hallway. Nothing. The air was thick, suffocating. There was no one there. Dylan's heart pounded in his chest. Was it his mind playing tricks on him again? Or was something or someone trying to reach him? The walls felt like they were closing in. He could feel the oppressive weight of the house, the air thick with memories, with ghosts he couldn't outrun. But there was no escape. The past had followed him home, and there was nowhere left to hide. Dylan's mind, though, refused to allow anything normal. He tried to distract himself by turning on the television, but the sound didn't reach him. It was as if it were happening in another world, a world that no longer held any relevance to him. He muted the volume and let the screen flicker, half-heartedly watching reruns of shows that once made him laugh. The quiet creak of a floorboard behind him broke his trance. It was faint, but he heard it as clearly as if it were a shout in his ear. His head snapped to the side, and his breath hitched in his throat. His eyes scanned the room, heart pounding. He was alone. No one was there. But then the footsteps came again, louder this time, like someone was walking slowly down the hall toward him. Dylan's body went rigid. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he was frozen in place, unable to move. "Mom! Dad!" His voice cracked. No response, only the sound of footsteps. He felt his throat tighten as his breath grew shallow, The footsteps grew closer, and with each step the air seemed to grow colder, thicker. His skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, of being stalked by something unseen. The days began to blur into each other. Time didn't matter. He didn't keep track of the hours. He spent most of his time in the living room, staring out the window, watching the world move on without him. His mother continued to bring him food, tried to engage him in conversation, but the distance between them felt insurmountable. His father tried to engage him in simple conversations about old hobbies, things they used to enjoy, but Dylan's responses were short, clipped. He couldn't bring himself to be interested in anything anymore. By the end of the week, the house seemed even more suffocating. Dylan felt trapped. There was no escape. The rooms felt like tombs, each corner holding some silent witness to the horrors of his past. The weight of his memories had become unbearable, and there was no one to help him share the burden. One evening, as Dylan sat in the darkened living room, the silence was deafening. His mother had gone to bed early that night, worn out from her repeated attempts to reach him. His father was out on the porch, reading the newspaper, as he always did in the evenings, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. They didn't see the way his eyes darted nervously when someone spoke too loudly, or the way his body tensed every time a car drove by. They couldn't hear the voices that whispered in the back of his mind, pulling him back to places he never wanted to revisit. He started avoiding the mirror. When he did look at his reflection, he hardly recognized the person staring back at him. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. But it wasn't just the physical toll that haunted him. It was the look in his eyes, the look of someone who had seen too much, someone who had lost something they couldn't ever get back. Every time he looked in the mirror, he was reminded of the man he used to be, the man who had dreamed of a future full of possibility, who had hoped for a life of normalcy. But that man was gone, and in his place was a soldier, wounded, broken, and haunted by things he couldn't forget. But no matter how much he tried to pull away, his parents kept pushing him to face reality. His mother, bless her heart, was persistent. Every morning she would ask him if he wanted to go out for a drive, to visit family friends, to simply get some air. And every day Dylan would refuse, each excuse more fragile than the last. He stopped sleeping. Even when his eyes would finally drift shut, the nightmares would come, relentless and terrifying. But the nightmares weren't the only thing keeping him awake. It was the constant feeling of being watched, of hearing things just out of reach, that made him lie awake, staring into the dark, frozen in place. The walls of his childhood home, his sanctuary, his place of safety, now felt like a prison. It was hard to tell when it started, but Dylan's isolation deepened over time. He didn't want to leave the house. The outside world no longer felt like a safe place. His parents' attempts to get him to go out, whether for dinner or a walk, were met with excuses. He couldn't bring himself to do it. The thought of interacting with anyone, even for a few minutes, made his skin crawl. They didn't understand. No one did. His father, ever the stoic figure in Dylan's life, kept trying to convince him that everything would be fine if he just pushed through it, if he just gave it time. But Dylan knew better. Time hadn't healed anything. He felt as if he were slowly losing control of his own mind, drowning in memories that refused to let him go. The people around him, his parents, friends, didn't see the cracks in his facade. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, more intense than ever before. His mind was racing, but it wasn't just fear that gripped him. It was something else, something darker, something that he couldn't explain. And for the first time since he returned, Dylan realized that he might not be alone in this house. The shadows in his mind weren't the only thing he needed to be afraid of. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and fear. Dylan could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was a product of his fractured mind. His body was physically present in the house, but his mind felt as if it were still trapped somewhere far away, somewhere on the other side of the world, in the trenches of war. At first he had convinced himself that the strange occurrences, flickering lights, the scraping sounds, the blood on the photo, were nothing more than his imagination. His mind, worn thin from months of trauma, was just playing tricks on him. The constant exposure to war had left its scars, some visible and others not so easy to see. He'd been warned that coming back home wouldn't be as easy as walking back into his old life, but he hadn't realized just how deep the damage ran. The unease grew worse the following days. Small things kept happening. He would hear faint whispers in the dead of night, whispers that sounded like voices but were too quiet to make out. Sometimes, when he would open a drawer, it would be ajar just a little bit more than when he last left it. He would swear that the items in his room had been moved, even though no one had been in there. One afternoon, as Dylan was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the television that wasn't even on, a picture frame fell off the shelf above him, shattering on the floor. The glass scattered, but the photo remained intact. It was a picture of him and his best friend from high school, a friend who had joined the military with him and was killed in battle. The photo was now face down on the floor. He hadn't touched that frame since his return. Dylan stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He slowly walked over to the broken frame, bent down, and picked it up. His breath hitched when he saw that the photo wasn't just face down. It was also smeared with something dark. Blood. No, it couldn't be. The smear was faint, but unmistakable. Dylan dropped the photo, stumbling back in shock. He looked at the shattered glass and the bloodstain on the picture. The photo was of him and his friend, but why was there blood on it? That night, as he sat in the living room, the lights flickered again, this time more erratically. Dylan clenched his fists, frustration building inside him. He stood up and walked toward the light switch, determined to turn it off. But as he reached for the switch, the lights stopped flickering abruptly, plunging the room into darkness. He froze. The sudden silence that followed was deafening. A soft, scraping noise came from the hallway, like something being dragged across the floor. Dylan's heart began to race. He knew he had locked all the doors. There was no one else in the house. The sound grew louder, closer, and his breath caught in his throat. Slowly, he turned toward the hallway, but the light from the living room illuminated nothing but empty space. There was no one there. Nothing moved. He could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the sound of a car driving by outside, but the scraping noise was gone. Dylan stood frozen for a moment, trying to rationalize it. It was just the house settling again. The wind had knocked something loose. It was nothing. But deep down, he knew it wasn't nothing. Something was wrong. The next day, he decided to go for a walk, hoping some fresh air would clear his head. The sun was bright, but the warmth of the day didn't seem to reach him. He walked through the neighborhood, passing by familiar houses and landmarks. His feet moved mechanically, as if he were going through the motions, but his mind was elsewhere. As he passed a familiar street corner, something caught his eye. A figure, just a glimpse, standing near the old park. For a brief moment, Dylan thought he recognized the person, but as he blinked, the figure disappeared. He stopped in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. The park was empty. There was no one there. He shook his head, thinking it was just his imagination. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or perhaps the lingering effects of his sleepless nights. But the feeling of being watched lingered in his chest. It was the same feeling he had when he was in the war, when he was certain that something or someone was out there, waiting for him. When Dylan returned home, his mind was still racing. His hands were shaking as he unlocked the front door. He tried to tell himself that he was being paranoid, that he was simply imagining things, but the sense of dread wasn't something he could shake off so easily. It wasn't just the lights. That night, the door to the room he was staying in creaked open on its own. Dylan had locked it before going to bed. He knew he had, but when he woke in the middle of the night, he found the door ajar, just a few inches, as if someone had carefully opened it without disturbing the air. His heart raced. He told himself it was nothing, just the wind maybe, or the house settling. After all, it had been a while since anyone had lived in this house. The house had a way of making sounds, creaks and groans that could be easily explained away. But the cold feeling he had when he saw the door wasn't something that could be dismissed. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, his skin prickling with a sense of dread. Still, he tried to convince himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. He had been through a lot, after all. His memories of the war, the things he had seen, had left deep scars. Maybe it was all part of the trauma, his mind grasping at things that weren't really there. But the unease kept gnawing at him, a constant weight in the pit of his stomach. One night, Dylan was sitting on the couch, flipping through an old photo album his mother had insisted he look through. The pictures felt like a lifetime ago. There was a younger version of him, smiling with friends at the beach, looking carefree. But as he turned each page, he felt more disconnected from the person in the photos. It was as if the boy in the pictures wasn't him anymore, as if the life he once knew had already slipped through his fingers. The first flicker of the lights happened when he turned to a page with a picture of his old dog Buddy, who had passed away years ago. He remembered playing fetch with Buddy in the yard, but now the memory felt distant, like a dream. The lights overhead blinked just for a second. A quick flicker that made him glance up in confusion. He assumed it was a short circuit, a random glitch. But then it happened again, and again. Each time the lights would flicker more violently, like the electrical current was struggling to maintain its hold. Dylan rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the feeling of unease creeping into his mind. As the day wore on, Dylan sank deeper into his mind. He couldn't leave the house, couldn't face the world outside. The idea of reconnecting with old friends, of moving on, seemed too distant, too impossible. No matter how hard he tried, the shadows in his mind would never let him go. It had been a week since Dylan had returned home. Every day felt like a blur of waking up, eating, and existing without truly living. His parents tried their best to make him feel at ease, but no matter how much they tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was a stranger in his own life. He would catch himself staring out the window for hours, unable to focus on anything. The images from the war, those visceral memories, kept resurfacing, haunting him, no matter how hard he tried to push them away. But it wasn't just the memories that troubled him. There were other things, small things, that didn't feel right, things he couldn't explain, things that made his skin crawl. It started with the lights. He stood by the window, looking out at the street, the houses lining the neighborhood, the kids playing in the yards. For a moment, he almost believed that everything was normal again, that he could just walk out there and blend in. But then the memory of the battlefield slammed into him, and he felt as if he were suffocating. The air outside no longer felt fresh. It felt thick, oppressive, like it carried the stench of war. Dylan's breathing became shallow, and he gripped the windowsill, his knuckles turning white. His mind was spinning, each thought more disturbing than the last. The idea of facing the world outside, of pretending to be the man he once was, felt impossible. He had seen too much, been through too much, and the truth was, he didn't know if he would ever feel safe again. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breath, but the memories came rushing back. The fear, the blood, the screams. It all came flooding back in an instant, and for a moment, it felt like he was back there, in the middle of the war, with no escape. Not again, Dylan whispered to himself, fighting to push the images away. But they wouldn't leave. The darkness was closing in, and he didn't know how to escape it. "I'm not really in the mood for that," Dylan replied, his voice flat. He could feel the weight of his parents' eyes on him, but he couldn't meet their gaze. He didn't want to see the pity in their eyes. They were trying so hard to make things right, but it wasn't something they could fix. Not with a trip to the beach or a walk in the park. This wasn't something that could be healed with kindness, not when the wounds were so deep, buried under layers of guilt and horror. His father sighed, clearly disappointed, but not surprised. "All right, son, just let us know when you're ready. We're here for you." Dylan nodded, but didn't respond. He felt a lump form in his throat, but he quickly swallowed it down. The thought of opening up to his parents, of telling them everything, was overwhelming. They had no idea what he had been through. They couldn't possibly understand the things he had seen, the things he had done. After breakfast, his mother insisted on doing the laundry, a simple task she had always done to keep busy, to avoid facing the emotions she didn't know how to deal with. Dylan was left alone in the house, with nothing but his thoughts and the gnawing feeling that he wasn't truly home. Dylan didn't meet her eyes. Instead, he stared at the table, focusing on the grains in the wood, as if they could offer him some semblance of peace. But the thoughts kept coming, relentless and unforgiving. He could still hear the screams of his comrades, the sound of the mortars exploding in the distance. The chaos of war had imprinted itself in his mind like a brand, and no matter how hard he tried to move on, it wouldn't let him go. It was as if he had become a part of that chaos, tangled in a web of trauma that he couldn't escape. "So," his father said, his voice taking on a cautious tone, "what do you want to do today? We thought we could go out, get some fresh air, maybe show you around town. We could visit your old favorite spots." The offer was kind. It was meant to be comforting, a way for Dylan to reconnect with his old life. But the idea of going out, of pretending everything was fine, felt impossible. He couldn't stand the thought of being surrounded by people who didn't understand. The world outside seemed so far removed from the things he had seen. He wanted to scream, to tell them that he wasn't the same person anymore, but the words wouldn't come. Dylan didn't meet her eyes. Instead, he stared at the table, focusing on the grains in the wood, as if they could offer him some semblance of peace. But the thoughts kept coming, relentless and unforgiving. He could still hear the screams of his comrades, the sound of the mortars exploding in the distance. The chaos of war had imprinted itself in his mind like a brand, and no matter how hard he tried to move on, it wouldn't let him go. It was as if he had become a part of that chaos, tangled in a web of trauma that he couldn't escape. "So," his father said, his voice taking on a cautious tone, "what do you want to do today? We thought we could go out, get some fresh air, maybe show you around town. We could visit your old favorite spots." The offer was kind. It was meant to be comforting, a way for Dylan to reconnect with his old life. But the idea of going out, of pretending everything was fine, felt impossible. He couldn't stand the thought of being surrounded by people who didn't understand. The world outside seemed so far removed from the things he had seen. He wanted to scream, to tell them that he wasn't the same person anymore, but the words wouldn't come. When he finally made his way downstairs, his parents were already seated at the dining table, their eyes full of concern. They tried to act normal, as if this was a regular homecoming, but Dylan could see through the facade. He knew they were worried about him. His father's frown was barely noticeable, but it was there. His mother's smile was too bright, too forced. "Morning, son. How'd you sleep?" his father asked, his voice gentle but laced with hesitation. Dylan sat down at the table without answering immediately. He reached for a piece of toast, but his hands shook, making it difficult to pick it up. The motion felt mechanical, as if he were going through the motions without really being present. He forced himself to take a bite, but the taste was bland, unremarkable. It didn't even register in his mind. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the same lie he told himself every day. The words slipped out so naturally, as if he had practiced them 1,000 times. He didn't know how to admit that he wasn't fine, that he was drowning in a sea of memories and emotions he couldn't control. His mother placed a glass of orange juice in front of him, her hands trembling ever so slightly. She had always been the pillar of the family, strong, dependable. But now she looked fragile, like something could shatter her at any moment. Nothing was familiar anymore. Not the way the sun streamed in through the windows, not the soft hum of his mother's voice calling him to breakfast. Nothing felt like home. His stomach churned with unease, but he forced himself to sit up, rubbing his face as if he could rub away the fog in his mind. He wanted to push it all away, wanted to get up and start living again, like nothing had changed. But that wasn't possible, not anymore. Dylan stood, unsteady on his feet, as if the very act of standing was a struggle. The house felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in on him as he moved toward the bathroom. The cold tile of the floor chilled his feet, grounding him, but it didn't ease the growing panic in his chest. His hands shook as he splashed water on his face, trying to shake off the images that followed him in the mirror. His reflection seemed like a stranger, someone he didn't recognize. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale. He didn't know how to explain what he was feeling. Was it just exhaustion? Was it the war? Or was there something darker creeping into his soul? His breath came in shallow gasps. He wasn't sure if it was the room or his mind that was playing tricks on him, but the fear he felt was all too real. The rest of the night passed in torturous silence, and when the morning sun finally crept through the blinds, Dylan knew he hadn't slept at all, and yet somehow he was more awake than ever. This was his new reality. The morning came slowly, like a dull ache that wouldn't go away. Dylan stared at the ceiling, his body frozen in place. He was awake, but not really. His mind kept replaying the same fragmented images from his time in the war. Images of smoke-filled skies, the deafening crack of gunfire, the faces of his fallen comrades. The pain from the battlefield wasn't something that could be shaken off in a single night. The shadows of war had already claimed his thoughts, and there was no escaping them. The soft sound of footsteps from downstairs made him blink, as if it were the first time he realized he was in a house, in a bed, back home. His mother was making breakfast, and the familiar smell of bacon and eggs wafted up through the house, but it only served to remind him that he wasn't in a place where the smells could comfort him. A soft click came from the window, followed by the faintest rustling noise, and for a moment, Dylan's heart raced. He was instantly on edge, sitting up in bed, his hands gripping the sheets. His mind flashed to the battlefield, where every sound, no matter how small, could mean life or death. He held his breath, listening. It came again, another click, a faint tapping, as if something was scraping against the window. It wasn't the wind. Dylan knew the sound. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as the realization hit him. He wasn't alone in the room. His senses were heightened. He could feel it. Someone or something was outside that window, watching him. Dylan rose from the bed, his body stiff, his heart pounding in his chest. He took slow, deliberate steps toward the window, every part of him screaming to run, to hide, but his feet were glued to the floor. He reached for the curtain, hesitated, and then yanked it back with a jerk. Nothing. No one was there. But the air felt colder, the room darker. Dylan couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on him. Not just any eyes, but the eyes of the men he had left behind in the war. Their faces, their voices, all of it clung to him, unwilling to let go. For the rest of the evening, the conversation was strained. His parents tried to keep it light, asking about his journey back and about the people he had met along the way. But Dylan couldn't engage. His mind was elsewhere, on the battlefield, in the trenches, in places he didn't want to remember. When they finally went to bed, Dylan lay in the guest room, the bed too soft, the sheets too clean. He stared up at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of the house settling. The room was dark, but it was too quiet. It reminded him of the stillness before the storm, the kind of silence that made his skin crawl, the kind of silence he hated. His hand reached over to the nightstand, fumbling for his phone. He turned on the screen, but the bright light made him squint. It was nearly 2 a.m. He had been back for almost 48 hours, and sleep hadn't come. Not since he landed at the airport. He scrolled through his messages, but there was nothing of substance. Just notifications, random updates, and pictures of friends and family moving on with their lives. He wasn't part of that world anymore. He couldn't be. It was too much of a disconnect. His finger hovered over the contact name of a friend from his unit, someone who had been with him through everything. But he hesitated. He hadn't spoken to him since the last mission, and the words he needed to say were tangled up in his mind. Each corner seemed to hold a piece of a past that no longer fit. His eyes darted from object to object, but it was as though he couldn't truly focus on anything. His mind was elsewhere, trapped in the war, in the screams, in the fire. "Dylan, how are you feeling?" His mother's voice broke through the fog of his thoughts, pulling him back into the moment. The question, simple as it was, hit him harder than he expected. How was he feeling? He didn't know how to answer. How could he explain the cold, suffocating void that had settled in his chest, or the way his body tensed every time the front door creaked, or when footsteps echoed too loudly in the hallway? How could he explain the nightmares that had been torturing him since the moment he boarded the flight home, and the moments when he woke up in a cold sweat, convinced he was still in the middle of a firefight? "Fine," Dylan lied. The lie slipped out easily, as it always did. "I'm fine." His mother didn't seem convinced, but she nodded, stepping aside to let him move further into the house. His father offered him a drink, whiskey, his favorite, but Dylan shook his head. The idea of drinking felt wrong, especially after everything that had happened. "Dylan," his mother said, her voice shaky as she took a step forward. She reached out, arms trembling, and pulled him into a tight embrace. For a moment, he let himself be held, but only for a moment. He couldn't shake the feeling that if he stayed in her arms for too long, something would break. Something inside him would crack wide open, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for that. His father stood behind her, his hand pressed firmly to his side, a grim expression on his face. Dylan could sense the weight of their concern, but he couldn't bring himself to look at them for too long. The guilt was too much. Guilt for the things he had done, the things he had seen, and the parts of him he felt were lost forever. "Welcome home, son," his father said in a voice that was quieter than usual. Dylan nodded, but the words didn't register in his mind. What did welcome home even mean? What home was he supposed to be returning to? He wasn't the same person anymore, not even close. After a few moments, he pulled back and stepped inside the house. His parents had rearranged the furniture, painted the walls a lighter color to brighten things up. Dylan hardly noticed. His eyes scanned the room. His childhood home was too familiar, and yet it felt foreign. It had been over 2 years since he'd enlisted, and the boy who once lived here, the carefree young man who hung out with friends at the beach, laughed at silly jokes, and planned for a future full of possibilities, no longer existed. The soldier who stepped out of that cab was a shell, a man broken into pieces no one, not even himself, could put back together. "Home sweet home," he muttered, trying to muster a smile as he paid the driver and grabbed his duffel bag. His fingers brushed against the fabric, and it felt strange, heavy, like it carried the weight of the past, even though it only held his belongings. His parents' house looked the same, but there was an unsettling feeling hanging in the air. The world outside seemed oblivious to the things Dylan had seen, the horrors that still clung to him like the dirt he'd never been able to scrub off in the months since his return. The front door opened slowly, and there they were, his mother, her face etched with lines that hadn't been there before, and his father, a man who had always been larger than life, now looking smaller and more fragile than Dylan remembered.